This course is intended to be accessible and relevant to absolutely anyone who has experienced abuse, and I feel it's especially important that it's accessible to those who have recently escaped. Because of that, I want to acknowledge that even though you might not want to have contact with an ex-abuser, you may still have to. You might have to communicate about children or pets or belongings, about business, about appointments, finances, accommodation, transport, whatever it is. I get that block and delete might just not be practical right now, and that's okay. You do you, and you do whatever you feel comfortable with. I'm going to run through a few of the different communication strategies that you can adopt, and then we're going to talk about why these particular strategies work and how to implement them. Now, it might sound a bit like some sort of corporate training video when I say things like communication strategy, but by having a clear plan of how you're going to handle any contact, you're taking the first steps to creating boundaries and demonstrating that we're no longer under anyone else's control. There are a few different strategies that are commonly used with an ex-abuser, and these are no contact, minimal contact or grey rock, third-party contact, and formal third party. And all of these strategies for communication centre on the notion that there should be no emotion in any of the contact between you and the abusive party. We'll talk about why that is in just a moment, but before we do, I just want to do a quick run through of these strategies and point you in the direction of a further resource that I've created to help you to implement the communication strategy that's right for you and your life situation. So, no contact. This is when you cease to have any contact with the other party. There's absolutely none. There's no responding whatsoever, and it doesn't matter how they contact you or what tactics they use to get to you. You just don't reply. There's no contacting them to tell them that you're not contacting them. There's no trying to have the last word. And when exercising no contact, you must never underestimate them or expect any kind of closure or fall for the flying monkeys, which are people that they might have recruited to try and get in touch with you on their behalf or get a message to you through a mutual friend or acquaintance. Often these people have been convinced by the abuser that they are in fact the victim, or you are overreacting in some way. No contact means you don't respond to them either. You don't spy on any social media, and you don't at any point believe that they've changed. Now, this tactic isn't always easy, but it is the most effective when it comes to removing the toxic energy and moving forward with your life. One of the most common issues with no contact is that when there are children involved, and if you don't have any children and you've tied up any and all of those loose ends that you need to, then no contact is absolutely the strategy for you. It can be difficult as that trauma bond is well and truly tugging, but if you keep doing the work to break the bond and release that energy, your road to healing becomes much more direct and easier to navigate if you're not in contact, and you rest safe in the knowledge that you won't ever be contacting them again. So depending on the situation, it might be appropriate to involve a third party. This might be a formal third party, such as a mediation service or legal representation who'll carry out any and all communication on your behalf. Or it might be an informal third party who acts as a go-between to ensure that communication remains relevant and constructive. Even with third-party communication strategies, it's vital that any and all emotion is left out of communication between you and that abusive party. You must ensure that those boundaries have been made clear to the third party so that they either don't disclose emotion-based information, or they know not to respond to it, or they know to not relay it to you when you want to be focusing your attention on healing. So the other method, the one with the weird name, this grey rock strategy, well, that means doing exactly what it sounds like and behaving like a grey rock, a boring, nondescript, minimally interesting rock. I put together a separate video which you can watch to learn how to create your strategy, and you can use this exact same method with the other strategies I've mentioned, because it teaches you how to identify what you're prepared to talk about, how you're going to communicate, and how much time you're going to take over those responses. In order to understand why these communication strategies, where we withhold any small talk, any niceties, we keep the emotion out of it, and we don't share any personal information or explain why you're not willing to reconcile, it's important to understand the mindset of an abuser and the dynamic of the relationship between them and us. Now, I'm not into labelling or diagnosing other people who haven't undergone professional assessment. However, in order to identify and understand what it is that makes someone's behaviour abusive and how and why certain behaviours from us can result in different outcomes than we might associate to normal, it's useful to look at psychology and personality disorders, as they can give us an indication of what to expect from behaviours of people who abuse others. The abuse dynamic is based on power and control. The abusive party is a dominator, a person who believes that their self-worth is directly associated to how much control they have over other people. And depending on how much of this power they personally crave will depend how many situations they try to exact that control. Some might seek to control individuals and professionals, others might seek to control whole groups, workforces, congregations, or even entire nations if we look back over history, and some seek to have power over their partners and their families. Now, this might be through their appearance to the outside world. It might be what they wear, who they spend their time with, where they go, what they spend their money on, how they talk to one another, or what kind of parent they are. It might be about what kind of sexual acts take place, or what kind of medical treatment they undergo. They might exact control by being unfaithful, or by convincing someone that they are physically or mentally unwell and they need them. It could be just one of these things, or it could be all of them. And these things, they might be done in a covert and insidious manner, in secret and gradually, where we don't notice that the control is being taken away from us. Or it can be done in an obvious fashion, where they outwardly establish that they and their needs are more important than yours, and because of this you're inferior and they are entitled to the power. Now, this extraction of power can be termed as seeking supply from another. And so with each emotional or physical display of power and control, the response from the other party goes in some way to feed or fuel or supply the abuser with that sense of power that they crave. And the labels for people who behave like this range from control freak or bully to narcissist or psychopath. And since this behaviour really does exist on a scale and includes behaviours which we ourselves and others and our children may have displayed at different times in life, in order to not confuse abuse with acts of self-protection or self-defence, the thing that we look to distinguish is the intention and whether there is empathy present. Empathy is the ability to put yourself into someone else's shoes, to imagine what it would be like to experience what they have or are going through, and then respond appropriately and share in their feelings. Anyone who seeks to control another person lacks the capacity to do this, as if they could place themselves in another person's shoes and empathise with them, then they wouldn't continue to behave like this or get any kind of satisfaction or supply from the behaviour. Now, it's important to note that there may be many reasons why someone lacks empathy, and it might not be a conscious thing. According to psychologists, our ability to put ourselves into another person's shoes is something that develops in us at a fairly young age, around 5 to 9 years old. And if we experience trauma or have parents who model certain behaviours, maybe we've been highly praised or spoilt, or our emotional intelligence hasn't been fostered through support and understanding, then there's this chance that subconsciously we turn to these self-gratifying and controlling behaviours as they produce the outcome our brain and our body desires. Now, that's not necessarily ones that are socially or morally acceptable. But we must remember that there is no excuse for abuse. It might help to explain it, and growing up in a society where some of these traits are normalised and are socially acceptable behaviours does compound the problem even further. But ultimately, if we respect the other human being with whom we're interacting and they are saying no, or they're showing signs of being upset or distressed, or there are rules and laws in place to prevent and punish this kind of act, then every human has control over their behaviour and has the choice to continue or to stop what they are doing at any and all times. Now, as I mentioned, this is a very, very brief overview of the dynamic of abuse, and like all psychology, it's rooted in theory based mainly on observations and self-reporting. There's still a lot of work to be done in understanding how people become abusers and why treatment and rehabilitation is something that rarely works with these people. Personality disorders in themselves are problematic for health professionals since they so rarely respond to treatment, and the diagnostic criteria that they follow are so broad and so subjective. Now, whilst on the point of personality disorders, I do feel it's important to acknowledge that whilst narcissistic personality disorder, sociopathy and psychopathy all come under the same cluster B category as emotionally unstable personality disorder or borderline personality disorder, there's a very important distinguishing factor in that those with EUPD do have empathy. In fact, in many cases, they have so much empathy that they are overrun with emotions such as guilt, blame, and shame, which, when unmanaged, cause them to experience depression. They may self-harm by means of physical injury, a lot of suicidal ideation is experienced, and compulsive behaviours like gambling, addiction, or eating disorders are common. The field of mental health and psychology is vast, and for victims of abuse, it can be a fascinating field where we can really grow our understanding of other people and how and why they act in certain ways. And there are many survivors who have gone on to use their own personal experience as a catalyst to change their own career or offer support to those who they can empathise so strongly with. The future really can be whatever you want it to be, and we'll come back to that a little later in the course. But with so many labels and a spectrum of symptoms, behaviours and classifying factors, keeping our focus on this idea of supply as a fuel or currency that an abuser craves or attempts to extract from their victim, we can start to understand why methods like no contact and grey rock work, by removing this supply and therefore not feeding the dominator's appetite for power. Having this understanding of the supply dynamic makes it easier to not only develop a strategy for communication and set boundaries, it also gives us more confidence when they're challenged. On each occasion when an interaction might take place, you can ask yourself, am I giving them supply right now? And if the answer is yes, you can adjust your course of action to one where there is little or no emotional energy upon which they can feed. It's also useful information for dealing with other toxic people who you may come across in your life. This kind of power and control dynamic can be found everywhere, and if we take responsibility for how we set and maintain our own boundaries, we're generally going to feel more secure, confident, and have a higher level of self-worth. So there's absolutely no reason why you can't take all the information from today's module and apply it to all areas of your life where someone may attempt to cross one of your personal boundaries. Identifying and setting those boundaries is something we'll look at as we move through the course as well. Having looked at the communication strategies and the theory behind abuse and supply and the abuse dynamic, the final part of this education element is just to have a look at red flags. Because now we know what the motive is behind abuse and how to communicate with those who might be toxic for our lives, we need to have a way to spot these people so we can ensure that we're not victimised by others in the future. Now, having been victimised by an abuser, it will mean that you're well aware that it's not easy to spot the signs of an abuser. They're often very good liars, they're manipulators, and they're able to disguise their true intentions. However, we do all possess a tool that we can use alongside this knowledge to protect ourselves in the future, and this is our intuition. You might even remember a time when something did feel off about that abusive partner and you dismissed it or you felt like it could be explained away. Well, it's that feeling, that's what we need to spend some time really working with, because everyone's intuition is slightly different and it can be felt in different places for different people. Some feel it in their stomach, hence the phrase gut feeling, and others may find it's in their chest or it presents as a headache. I personally feel my intuition run down the back of my legs. But wherever you feel it, you'll know, and especially if you've got children and you can either tell when they're coming or if they're telling the truth about feeling unwell, it's learning to trust that feeling that's your biggest weapon in protecting yourself. If it feels off, if you're questioning someone's motives, if you just aren't sure about something, the chances are it's your intuition and it's trying to alert you and indicate that you need to either protect yourself or you need to do more inner work before progressing with a decision. Now, you might also find that it's telling you to go for something and that it's going to be good. And when that happens, listen to it then too. Now, alongside our intuition, there are certain behaviours which can indicate underlying motives or a desire for power and control. And so to finish off this section of the module, we're going to look at around 20 examples of what we call red flags. Because when you observe these behaviours and find that your intuition is alerting you to something not being quite right, the chances are you need to listen, establish your boundary and remain firm in order to prevent any unwanted or unacceptable further treatment. Now, obviously humans are pretty complex creatures and we do all sorts of things for all sorts of reasons. So some of these on their own might not be alarming, but just by sharing these, I know that it will alert someone somewhere in the future and could well protect you from more emotional distress and pain. So it's worth sharing them. The first one is that they can't stop telling you how perfect you are. Maybe their sex drive is much higher or lower than yours. We might see them push your physical boundaries in an innocent way, such as with tickling. Rushing a new relationship forward too quickly is a red flag, as is trying to drive a wedge between you and your family and friends. You might find that they roll their eyes at you a lot, or they describe all their exes as crazy. They might call you names in arguments, or they might have a really poor work ethic. They could be cruel to their parents, or you might see that their attitude changes really quickly. They could be on a different sleep schedule to you, or they might be secretive about little things. The red flag is if they cheated on their last partner with you, or if they demand your phone, email and social media passwords. Guilt tripping you at every chance they get, or having different financial values than you and then refusing to do anything about that and work together. Making you feel stupid, that's a red flag, as is making fun of you during sex. They might refuse to make your relationship public, or you feel like you need to give them constant reassurance. They might have a different idea than you of what it means to be faithful, or we might see them hold double standards a lot. And finally, on this list, which is far from exhaustive, they may find it really difficult to apologise. Now, these are all indicators of types of behaviour that lack empathy in the person displaying them. And so that is why, along with your intuition, they could be a good indicator to what's really going on with a person. And that's all for our education element of this module. It's possible that all of this information has thrown up more questions than answers. And as I've said, this is a broad subject, so selecting the most relevant information has been my goal here. This information is meant to empower you, and if you feel like you would like to know more, then I do encourage you to access further information from websites, from YouTube, speak to professionals, or look at books or journal articles. I'd just like to encourage you to take your time and keep an eye on the sources of information. As I mentioned, everything I've shared has been reviewed by a doctor working in a psychiatric hospital. So if you've got any questions, do share them in the group or do contact a member of the team and we'll be happy to help in any way that we can. Now stay tuned for your action, which is coming right up.